All right, social studies. It has been a long, long time, but it's time to dig back in. Just kind of a quick refresher. We haven't even gotten into the actual Civil War. We're talking about things right now that led up to the Civil War, and we've talked about people like Nat Turner, and we remember Nat Turner. He was a slave, but he was also taught how to read and write by the plantation owner, and as he was reading and writing, he was learning the Bible, and he was a preacher, and he eventually led some pretty brutal revolutions where he went around from plantation to plantation killing the owners and their families in order to free the slave from those plantations. And we moved past that, and we learned about Harriet Tubman, and we learned how she was standing up for slaves. And through some things that happened in her life, she ended up escaping from the plantation she was on, even at the threat of death, and made her way north. And when she got there, she thought, I'm going to go back and start getting some people, starting with my family. And she started the Underground Railroad. And today we're going to talk about a person, and obviously, if you look at the slide, his name is Dred Scott, and he's very similar but very very different. Where Harriet Tubman did the right thing even under the penalty of death if she had been caught. Um, Nat Turner did the right thing and actually did pay the penalty. They killed him. Dred Scott decided at some point that even though it was probably a threat to his life, he decided he was going to stand up and do the right thing. And before we get to him standing up and doing the right thing, we really kind of have to go back, as with most stories, to where things kind of started. And I think for him, it really all started when he was sold to a doctor. And this Dr. Emerson that he was sold to really was a very different thing for Dred Scott. It allowed Dred Scott to travel all across the United States. That wasn't very normal for slaves at that time. They typically were stuck on the plantations working pretty much sun up to sundown every day of the week. Um, he had a wife and kids that were able to travel with him. Again, very odd that that happened. And it was very, very different. But we have to kind of go back and think about that because I think very too often we just casually say, oh, this person was owned by or this person was sold by. And I know we've mentioned it. I mean, I know we mentioned it with Nat Turner, and we have to be very careful because it's too many people are so quick to say, "Oh, what a kind owner he had because he taught him to read and write." No, he owned a slave. It doesn't matter what you did. Like free the person and everybody else on the plantation, and then teach them to read and write in a school. Then we can talk about being kind. But if you own slaves, no, we're not even going to have that conversation. But again, and you can kind of see that here. Like, I just want to stop and think about this thing. Dred Scott was sold to someone. I know that on my way home, I stopped and I got some drinks, and the store sold me some drinks. The store owned the drinks, I gave them some money, and now I own the drinks. That seems very reasonable to me. But to walk to somebody and give them money and then they in turn give me a human being is something that I have a really hard time wrapping my mind around. And it's something that I'm not too sure I'm ever going to really thoroughly understand um, how that actually was allowed to take place and why the Civil War didn't happen faster. And we can get into a lot of the things and the thought processes and go through all of that later on. But it's definitely something that really bothers me when I think about it. The way that African Americans were treated and the way that they were just kind of treated as property. And that word is going to come up later on in the Dred Scott case. So again, he's sold to this doctor. And he was able to travel all over the place, which was definitely not normal at all. Um, he went to places like Wisconsin. He went to places like Illinois, and I'll give you a hint, and you could even see that up here. Um, just to, foreshadowing here, that's going to be very important. That he went to Wisconsin and Illinois. So later on, I need to go back and fix that. Dr. Emerson died. And the ownership, I guess, if you think about it, was passed on. The things that the husband owned were now the wives. She owned the slaves at this point. And when I say she was a pretty terrible person, not that Dr. Emerson was a great person, he owned slaves, but she was really bad. She would loan the entire family to other plantations if they thought they needed help. Oh, you need some help here. Take some of my slaves. Um, Again, like I kind of say in here, you might see it. I think it's right in here. I might loan my neighbor across the street. They might borrow a hammer or my leaf blower in the fall, and that's one thing. But to say, hey, by the way, um, let me this loan you this person is just kind of crazy and outrageous thinking to me. I have no idea what in the world. There are so many misspellings in here. I've got to go back and fix that. Um, this should say many people in the South, or where Cell came from, were treating human beings and people like inanimate objects. They were treating them like, oh, you're not much more worth than anything else than like a hammer. I'll just loan you out to somebody. Um, and I think it was at this point that Dred Scott basically said, "This ain't it, Chief. Something's got to change." And he decided, I'm going to do something about this myself. And he decided to sue for his freedom. He decided, I'm going to take Dr. Emerson's wife and some other folks to court, and I'm going to sue to get my freedom. And here's the thing, remember that foreshadowing we talked about? When the doctor would stay over in these places like Wisconsin and Illinois, these were free states. And it wasn't like today where the doctor can jump on a jet, fly somewhere, see somebody in the morning, and then jump on a jet and probably be home in the evening. To travel to Wisconsin or Illinois, you had to stay probably weeks on weeks on weeks before you would eventually make your way back home. And because they lived for an extended amount of time in these free states, super smart guy here, Dred Scott, said, hey, if I've lived in these free states for long enough and my family lived with me, that technically makes us free. We are no longer slaves because we are now living in a free state. Pretty smart. And I like that. And amazingly, he won his court cases. Because every time he won, they would come up with some sort of appeal and move it to a court that was a little bit higher up. He would win his case, and they would move his court to the next court. There would be an appeal. An appeal is like, we don't agree with what the court said. We would like somebody above them to make a decision. And it actually went to the court of all courts, the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, this is where Dred Scott lost his case, because you can't go any higher than the Supreme Court. And they decided, and we'll take a look at this on the next slide, that no, he cannot sue for his freedom. And you might be thinking, gee, thanks, Mr. Bullens. This is a stupid end to a story. Like, I was all pumped up to be like Harriet Tubman running the Underground Railroad and living life happily ever after. And here you are telling me that this guy lost. How in the world is this important in the terms of the Civil War? And why does that make Dred Scott an important African American figure? And I'll tell you why. Because he decided to take a stand and take people to court to sue for his freedom, it made other African Americans and slaves realize, you know what? This isn't the way things should be. And we should stand up and we should say, this is it. We've had enough. We should be free. We're all people just like you. And that was a very important turning point, because up until that time, um, I, I, I mean, I'm certain that they all thought this is not right, but I don't think that they were thinking we actually have a chance of having our voices being heard. And now they realize, wait a minute, like multiple courts heard his voice, although he may have lost at the end. Like we have a shot at changing the way things are. The people in the North kind of looked at this case and they were like, well, wait a minute now. This is terrible. You can't just bounce somebody around like, like property and trade them around and just do whatever you wish. That's not okay. Slavery, we've already said it once, slavery's not cool. And now we're really going to start taking a stand against this. So the North decided they were going to have to start doing even more. The South decided to start digging their heels in. And what I mean, like they said, you know what, we're not budging on this. We're not even going to listen to your ideas. We love slavery and we're going to keep on rolling with slavery, and we'll roll with slavery with or without you. And this is where I think the South kind of decided, you know what, maybe I don't want to be a part of this whole United States thing that we're doing. Um, we're not that far removed from when we decided to move away from England because they were, there was no religious freedoms. Now we've got the North trying to tell us what we can do about slaves or no slaves. Maybe we'll just separate from them. So I think like the seeds of secession were really being sown here, where the South was starting to decide, not officially yet, but they were starting to decide, you know what, I think I want to break away from those folks up north and start our own country down here. So you look at here, we kind of talk about this. It was called Dred Scott versus Sanford. And it is probably one of the most famous court cases of all time. So Scott had a lawyer. It wasn't just him in the courts. He had a lawyer. And he argued that, again, like we've already said, even though they were slaves, since they had lived in Illinois, where Dr. Emerson traveled too often, where slavery was illegal, that the Scots were themselves free. So again, the case went through all the different courts until it got to the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roger Taney decided that Dred Scott and his family were not entitled to bring a lawsuit because, get this, they were not official citizens of the United States and therefore didn't have the right to be doing any kind of lawsuits. There were 9 people. 7 of them agreed with this nonsense. Basically what they were saying, and this is literally what they were saying. Slaves don't have rights. They don't have a claim to freedom. And again, this is like, you can't go any higher. There's no one you can go to above the Supreme Court to say this is terrible thinking. Like, you can't think like this. I guess you could go to the president, but that wasn't something that he could do at the time. So here you are, you've got the biggest court of all, and they're basically saying, no, that's not okay because they don't have any rights at all. They also Taney talked about the Fifth Amendment, and this is insanity, claiming that private property could not be taken from its owner. So again, now the courts were basically saying that they have no rights, they have no due process, and they're essentially property. And again, we've already talked about how much of a problem I have with this. And I think this is where the people in the North are finally like, enough's enough. We need to step in and do something. The court ruled that the institution of slavery could not be prohibited in new territories. And get this, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Unconstitutional. So the people against slavery, they were done at this point. Okay, this confirms it. The Southerners are trying to extend slavery to all of the states. And we can't have this happen. this ruling was essentially one of the first stepping stones to the Civil War.